Delirium, science or construct. According to the British Journal of Anesthesia, the term delirium derives its meaning from the Latin word delire, which means to deviate from a single track. In its practical application, we can use the etymology of the word delirium to conclude that it refers to behavior or thoughts that are outside of what has been established as the norm for society. This, of course, presents an interesting dilemma. A delirium is dependent on what society considers normal, and it stands to reason that whether or not a person is considered delirious depends on the society that they are a part of. Even within a society, what may have historically been viewed as delirious may be considered acceptable in the present day and vice versa. This idea has caught traction among Western clinicians. As a text titled Our Most Troubling Madness, edited by T.M. Luhrmann and Jocelyn Marrow put it, referring to schizophrenia, compassionate clinicians try to make bad news sound better. They sometimes tell patients that their ability to see and hear what others do not would be highly valued in other societies. Of course, this interpretation too is overly simplistic, with it being incorrect to equate the symptoms of schizophrenia to the shaman's willful entrance into a more spiritual state, for example. Thus, one may wonder how we can understand delirium without insisting on a one-to-one correspondence with Western practices. In order to examine the implications of this fluid view of delirium, this podcast will attempt to address 3 questions. 1. What behaviors and characteristics have disqualified individuals from participating in their communities? 2. What is the role of sex and gender in labeling someone as delirious? And 3. How do these determinations reflect cultures? Finally, at the end of this podcast, we will touch briefly on the reasons why this topic is important for the everyday person. To choose a topic that is especially salient within the political climate of the United States today, a pertinent example would be the LGBTQIA+ community. Within the United States, there has been much discussion about whether or not same-sex relationships or identifying with a gender that is different than one's biological sex should be allowed. The crux of this debate can be boiled down to whether or not such behavior is normal, or even if it's harmful to society. For example, according to WCTI 12, a local news reporting site, just last week, South Carolina lawmakers have introduced a resolution asking the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the 2015 ruling that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide and return control over marriage laws to the states. This resolution, titled House Concurrent Resolution 5501, was sponsored by a group of Republicans that wanted to return the definition of marriage to a union of one man and one woman. Clearly, despite the victories of the LGBTQIA+ community in the 21st century, same-sex relationships are far from being completely normalized or accepted. Critics of the LGBTQIA+ community often use arguments that center around biological determinism, which, according to an open textbook written by Carl C. Mukhopadhyay and Tommy Blumenfield with Susan Harper, is a theory that claims males and females are born fundamentally different reproductively and in other major capacities and preferences. The two sexes are, by nature, biologically sexually attracted to each other, although women's sexual desire is underdeveloped and reproductively oriented. For example, take the Family Research Council in an article titled 10 Arguments from Social Science Against Same-Sex Marriage. For some context, in their own words, the Family Research Council, or FRC for short, is a non-research and educational organization dedicated to articulating and advancing a family-centered philosophy of public life from a biblical worldview. The FRC cites children's hunger for their biological parents and children's need for mothers and fathers as reasons for why same-sex marriage should not be allowed. With the latter, the article goes on to further describe how mothers and fathers each provide the child with something unique to their sex. For example, mothers give their children emotional security. Additionally, however, the article strongly emphasizes the fact that children raised by same-sex couples may be more likely to experience gender and sexual disorders, and that same-sex marriage would undercut the norm of sexual fidelity within marriage. Here we can clearly see how critics cite their arguments for same-sex marriage being harmful. I would even imagine the authors would agree that the word delirius would be apt here, around the ways that same-sex marriages violate the norms of American societies. Gender roles, sexual orientation, gender identity, purposes of marriage, role of parents, etc. It is interesting how these arguments center not just around preventing an individual from violating the norms of society, but also around preventing an individual, for example, parents, from teaching others, their children, to violate those same societal norms. To contextualize this claim, we can see how, according to an article titled Out of DSM, Depathologizing Homosexuality, written by Jack Drescher, that it was not until the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, a manual that compiled a list of disorders in order to guide psychiatrists in diagnosing patients, and also called DSM for short, that the diagnosis of homosexuality was removed. This, combined with the previously mentioned fact that same-sex marriage was only deemed a constitutional right in 2015, demonstrates how deviant behavior is not just used to disallow people from participating in key tenets of society, for example marriage, but this deviant behavior was and often is attributed to a pathological cause, demonstrating how the norms of society can become so influential that they become accepted science, thus taking something subjective and presenting it as objective. I think it is also important to point out that the labeling of this behavior as delirious results in a subsequent disqualification from participating fully in society. Indeed, not only are critics attempting to stop members of the LGBT community from participating in marriage, an institution that has remained essential within the United States, but they are also attempting to stop the members from participating in child rearing. Thus, this is a good example of how a society might disqualify individuals from participating in order to preserve the norms, traditions, and practices of their society. With this in mind, it makes sense that fluidity in gender identity and sexual orientation is more acceptable in societies that have already established these norms as non-destructive or even beneficial for society. Take, for example, the Zuni people of New Mexico. For one, beginning in the pre-contact era, these people lived in, according to the same open textbook referenced previously, a relatively gender egalitarian horticultural society. Immediately, this can be contrasted with the American society, where the ideas of different spheres and roles for men and women still predominate in the thoughts of many conservatives and liberals alike. Perhaps because of the norm of equality between genders, the Zuni people have a third gender category in their society, one that is not man and not woman. This has been labeled as a two-spirit person, and this phenomenon can be found in many other indigenous communities. For example, a two-spirited Zuni man may choose to wear clothing that is associated with women and participate in activities and hold preferences that are more common among women than men. What more, these two-spirited Zuni men often marry other men. Far from receiving the same criticism that members of the LGBTQIA+ community may receive in the United States, within their society, again according to the open textbook, two-spirited Zuni individuals are generally accepted and even venerated. Additionally, while some in the United States blame same-sex attraction and gender confusion on gender and sexual disorders, to reference the Family Research Council again, going as far as believing that such disorders may be passed on to children, the Zuni people often attribute this inclination to dreams of selection by spirits. Thus, one can see how the Zuni people avoid labeling homosexuality or gender nonconforming behaviors as a disorder or delirium by normalizing it within their culture and attributing causes to it that agree with both their religion and culture. It is important to note that I am not arguing that the Zuni people or indigenous people more generally are overall more accepting than those in the United States. Indeed, even within the Zuni people and throughout many indigenous communities, it is rare for similar additional gender roles to be available to biological females, again according to that same open textbook. Additionally, according to James Adewumi in an article titled twins in West African culture and society of the Iron Age. Within some indigenous groups, such as the Igbo people, it is common practice to kill twins upon birth, as it is considered unnatural. While in the United States, having twins may be a sign of good luck. I use the examples of gender non-conforming individuals and atypical, to quote some sources, sexualities and common practices with twins to highlight the ways in which societal norms and commonly held beliefs regarding what is natural and normal subsequently influence what behavior is considered grounds for being disqualified from participating in society. But why does this matter? By understanding the ways in which our understanding of what behavior is grounds for disqualification from society is influenced by our personal beliefs, our culture, and the rules that govern our society, we might be able to more objectively view our own societies. Without this objective lens, it is easy to fall into the trap of assuming that our own ideas of normal or natural are universal truths of the human condition. When this happens, it is inevitable that we will engage in practices that unjustly discriminate against certain individuals. However, by being critical examiners of ourselves and our society, we might better be able to be open-minded, or perhaps even just more compassionate, when faced with views that seem to challenge our fundamental beliefs. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you tune in next time for more thought-provoking discussions. And I want to acknowledge and thank Professor Allison Bell for exposing me to many of the ideas that I develop in this podcast, as well as offering feedback on the first draft. I want to also thank my parents for offering additional feedback. And finally, I want to thank Washington and Lee University for providing the opportunity to take Introduction to Anthropology. Without the aforementioned individuals, this podcast would not be possible.